Hello, it's Dennis and I welcome you in my next tutorial. In previous videos, I've shown the way to create a procedurally generated terrain. Now I'd like to say a couple of words about how to add a manually generated areas to this procedural terrain. For example, we want to add a village, place objects and sculpt the terrain here using the standard Unity tools, and then log this village area from any procedural changes. Here we'll load the graph you might be already familiar with. It's the graph from the previous videos. You can find it among the MapMagic demo assets. It's called Simple Graph Objects. Here I'm using an empty scene with only basic lighting setup, and I will create a new MapMagic object by dragging the Simple Graph Objects to the scene view. Here you can see it creates the terrain with textures, trees, objects and grass. Now let's find the place for the village. For instance, it should be somewhere around here. Now we'll flatten the land for the village. I'm selecting the terrain by clicking on it, and as you can see, I'm using the standard Unity tools. Then I will remove the grass here. And then there are some trees left. Now I'm going to place some houses. I'll be using the structures that come with the Viking Village Unity package. It's a free asset made by Unity. You can download it from the asset store. I will speed up the playback so you don't have to wait for me. Let's disregard that we have a balcony here that actually makes this fence useless. Or probably not, don't know, it might be fortified somehow. Oh, this thing is too big. I saw some pretty sheds here, but I can't find them for now. The next thing I'm going to do is to paint textures here. I'll fill everything with the grass first. And then we'll paint some roads here. Blend in a bit of rocky texture too. And then add some grass. That one looks too dense. That's better. And I will plant the grass around, since no one is supposed to walk in here, and no one will trample it down. Then just a couple of tiny adjustments with the height, just to show what happens with a locked height map. It won't be so interesting if we will just let it be so flat. For now, I'm pretty happy with this village. Far from being perfect, but that should go. Now I will add a lock. I will do so by selecting the MapMagic object, and under the Logs tab, I will press the Add button. A new lock layer has been created. It should appear somewhere at the center of the terrain. Here we'll move it to the village with the standard move gizmo, and resize it by changing the radius value so that it includes the village and no more than that. When I'm happy with the lock position and the size, I press the Lock check button. And from now on this area is considered as the locked one. I will rename the log just for convenience. I'll call it Village. Here I will regenerate the terrain and describe what has happened. Everything that is inside this bright circle has remained unchanged. The terrain height, texturing, grass, it all remained the same. while everything that is within this dark circle has been gradually transitioned from our locked terrain to the generated one. Here let me change some fundamental values, like the main noise intensity or the noise size. See, everything around is changing, but not the village. No matter what is happening with the graph, the terrain changes I've made still remain. Now let me show you how does the transition value affect the look of the locked area. Let me unlock this and lower the transition. Here you can see that the blending between the locked area and the generated terrain became sharper. The transition value sets the distance between a fully locked internal circle and fully unlocked outer circle in world units. Here you can see the sharp borders caused by the small transition value. I will return it back to 20 or something. Don't forget to press the lock button, otherwise you will lose all of the changes within the lock circle. That's really important. The Sync Draft feature copies the lock information to the draft. This way it displays the locked area preview. Unfortunately, the draft is too low resolution for the lock size. It is just a couple of pixels on the height map. I guess I have to demonstrate it a bit later when I will add a bigger lock. And here is the feature that might be very useful for big terrain changes: the relative height. Before I will turn it on, I'd like you to have a look at our terrain tile objects. Here you can see the new object. Here's the locked objects game object, and it has a locked name, village, in its name. I will put the created village objects inside as children. Now I will turn the relative height on and will try to change the terrain height. Here you can see the whole of the locked area is traveling up with the terrain. Note that not only the object's height is changing, but the whole area, along with the flattened location we've made in the beginning. Actually, parenting all of the objects to the locked object transform isn't necessary, but this way they won't move together with the locked height. You can place the lock anywhere on the generated terrain, even on the seams between the tiles. Here, let's add one more lock by pressing the Add button. We'll put it on the terrain edge. And now it's colored red. That means that something went wrong. This is because the lock area has partially no terrain at all. We can still lock it, but newly generated tiles won't connect nicely with this. So I'm pinning the additional tile. And locking. Speaking of the draft sync, here you can see the low resolution lock area follows the high resolution one. Note that unfortunately there's no way to use the relative height feature when the lock is placed on the terrain seam. It just won't know the proper height. For each of the tiles it will be different, so it won't weld the lock area properly. The lock layers could be managed similarly to any other layers in the graph, like the texture layers or others. Clicking and holding on the place with no controls on it will make the layer drag. You can drag it above or below other layers to switch their position. Or you can drag it to the Remove button to delete it. There's an important thing about locks to remember. Although MapMagic will try to keep changes in the locked areas, it's always a good idea to keep the backup of your scene. In case if anything will go wrong, you can always load your scene and just apply the graph with all the changes to it. So make backups as often as possible when working with locks. And another thing to remember, make sure you've got the lock enabled and its lock check button pressed. Otherwise, MapMagic will flush all the terrain changes, like height, texturing and grass information. Happily, this is undoable. But anyways, try to remember to lock areas after you have moved or resized them. So, hope you will find the lock feature useful. Good luck with creating your custom areas on the procedural terrain. Thanks for watching. Bye.